Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit more with you about ethics in public speaking. I know I touched on this briefly in the introductory video where I talked about ethics as leadership and finding your voice and the ethics of voice, but there's so much more to ethics, and I wanted to make sure that we had some chance to talk about some of these issues together. So, the first thing to think about, of course, is when you decide to speak publicly or certainly to write a speech that you will be speaking, and certainly even when you write anything that involves a particular opinion or perspective, you need to make sure that your speaking or writing goal is an ethical, responsible one. As I said, this is not a class in debate where you would potentially be asked to argue a position that you don't believe. This is certainly not a class in forensic rhetoric, which is legal rhetoric, where you might be defending a client whose actions you disagree with and taking a perspective that you may not hold as your own perspective. There's some fine lines I think that lawyers are often faced with when they're defending clients. This is not a class in forensic rhetoric. But this is a class in public speaking where my expectation is that when you stand to speak, you have a responsible ethical goal and you're espousing a position or informing an audience about something about which you deeply care. So, setting a responsible goal, an ethical goal, initially as a speaker. As you know, we live in a democracy, and what that means for us in public speaking is that we are a nation that believes profoundly in the importance of public voice and using our voice to share our perspectives, to potentially persuade citizens of courses of actions, of beliefs. And that ability is not just a right, but a responsibility that is protected, starting with the First Amendment, the Freedom of Speech Act, and that was signed into law in 1791, and that in fact has been protected for many, many years. Your book talks about even a more recent situation in 1989 where the Supreme Court again protected freedom of speech in the decision that it was even free speech to burn the U.S. flag, that in fact burning the U.S. flag constituted a speech act, and that was also protected, that we as citizens have the right to challenge our democracy, to challenge the actions of our government, and not just a right but a responsibility to do so, but that when we do stand up and speak, that we do so ethically as well. So ethics of public speaking extend also to our audience. Not that we should not try to persuade an audience about a belief that they do not hold. In fact, again, moving a society forward is often challenging a society's views to have them adopt other views, other actions. Think, for example, about the importance of civil rights rhetoric when we lived in a country where it was legal to have separate but equal schools, quote unquote, separate but equal schools, where there were separate toilets and drinking fountains for African Americans and white Americans, where African Americans had to sit on the back of the bus. If a white American needed a seat, they had to get up and move. So this was law, and certainly was a lot of these laws were challenged by many great speakers who believed that our democracy had taken the wrong turn. And so they used their voice. They were often civilly disobedient. They engaged in acts that other Americans may have made them uncomfortable, but were essential for moving our society forward in terms of the civil rights legislation, of course, that was put in place. So sometimes we do need to take positions that our audiences don't agree with, but still we need to be sensitive to our audience and differences in our audiences. The fact that we are all different makes for an interesting world in which to live. Who would want to all be the same? But differences can often be a source of fear or discomfort. We tend to flock to people who are maybe more like us, and yet differences are what make us who we are and what makes life interesting. And as a speaker, we certainly try to draw on what we have in common with our audience because that creates identification, and we'll talk more about that. But also acknowledging differences are important as well. So to be respectful to audiences' differences and being very careful that you do not use language that is biased or prejudiced or disrespectful to other people. So, language, be very careful that you do not use language that is homophobic or racist or misogynistic, that would insult not just women or minorities, but all people. And sometimes when we go to make a point, we maybe don't think about how a particular word actually may be insulting to our audience. So being very careful about our word choice in terms of our audience, to be respectful of the audience, to know what the audience believes, and if you do want to persuade them, to realize the challenges you may face in terms of the differences of opinions that they may have, and being respectful of those differences of opinions and being open to listening to the views of others, which may disagree with your particular view that you're espousing in your speech. Ethics also involves when you're making an argument to prove a particular point, to make sure that you've engaged in sound reasoning, that the conclusions that you're drawing can in fact be drawn from the evidence that you're using, that you're using good solid reasoning. And we'll talk more about what that is in another session, but to really be very careful about the sources that you use, and that in fact when you are doing research for your speech, if you find a source that challenges your perspective, to not necessarily dismiss it or bury that source, but to engage that source and see if you can find other sources that challenge the results of that study or that particular perspective, and also potentially including that source or that study or that result that challenges your particular perspective in your speech. Now, certainly if you can counter it with a counter argument, that's always great, but even acknowledging that there's other data that may point to a different conclusion. It's important to be honest in this and being inclusive in the sources that you use, and not just using sources that support your particular opinion. It's also an ethical concern to, as with any writing, and the same with speaking, to make sure that you cite your sources and that you cite them fully, either verbally or in some written format. Sometimes it's possible to point your users to a website where your sources can be found, to, for example, have your sources listed on your PowerPoint or your keynote presentation for them to have access to those sources if they want to pursue the topic further, or even to verbally cite your sources. So something as simple as saying the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which was added in 1791. I mean, that's enough of a source cite. And if I wanted to actually say that the First Amendment reads that, quote, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, then I've cited that source. So verbal citation is certainly possible as well. Also, be very careful that when you present ideas, that you also cite ideas, not just direct quotes, as you know, to avoid plagiarism, and that you again cite ideas in ways that represent the idea, the intent of the idea. Don't take quotes out of context, don't take ideas out of context and use them to represent a position that in fact is not the position of the speaker or the writer. So be true to the intent of the source, to cite that source completely, and also to be very conscious of plagiarism, not just in terms of sources. And again, this should go without saying, but you're going to find that there are a lot of speeches on the internet, and your work, of course, should always be your own. And what value is this class to you if you aren't developing your own ability to write speeches, to present speeches? So ethically, the most profound violation is to use the speech of another. So some key things to think about in terms of the ethics of public speaking: the ethics of taking a responsible position that you believe in, the ethics of how you handle your sources in terms of completeness and citation, the ethics of how you use arguments, use reasoning to draw appropriate conclusions, and the ethics of being aware of audience differences and being respectful of your audience in terms of language choices, and also being open to different perspectives that that should be maybe even in a question and answer session after your speech would be appropriate to address, or to talk to some audience member who shares a different view even after your speech. Make a date, go have a cup of coffee, and maybe learn something about a different perspective that may in fact shape your own views as a member of a democracy.